the summer of 1884, the people of the Solomon Valley in Kansas watched the Hollis widow do something no one on the open plains had ever seen. She was building her house out of firewood. She was young for a widow, barely into her 30s, with a sun-browned face and a back already bent to the shape of long labor. Her name was Marta Hollis. Her husband, Elias, had died that spring of a summer fever that came on fast and left faster, taking him in 4 days before the doctor from the county seat could ride the distance. He left her a half-finished house on a low rise over the creek, a daughter named Nell, who was 7 that year, and a rangy yellow dog named Boone, who followed the child wherever she went. The neighbors expected her to do the sensible thing. A widow with a small child and no man to break the sod was supposed to sell the claim, take whatever the land would bring, and go back east to whatever family would still have her. Instead, Marta stayed, and when the frost was out of the ground, she began to build. A woman raising walls alone was, in that country, its own kind of scandal. There were men who would gladly have helped a widow load a wagon or pull a stuck calf, and a few of them offered once in the awkward manner of people who do not know what to say in the face of grief. But helping her build meant helping her build the thing itself, and no man in the valley wanted his name laid up in a wall of stove wood. So the offers came thin and went thinner, and soon stopped coming at all. Marta did not chase after them. She rose before the light, slaked her lime while the dew was still heavy on the grass, and set her courses through the long flat heat of the day with the child near her, and the dog asleep in whatever shade the wagon threw. She had no money to spare, no kin within 500 miles, and no one in the whole of the Solomon country who believed she was doing anything but digging a slow grave for herself and for her daughter. What held her to the labor was a thing she would not say aloud, a promise made to a man no longer there to hold her to it, and she meant to keep it course by patient course until the roof was on. She did not build as the other settlers built. There was no wagon of sawn boards, no fresh yellow pine hauled 40 miles from the rail depot at a price a widow could not dream of paying. What she had instead was wood. Cordwood, short lengths of oak and cottonwood and box elder, the kind of wood every family on the plains cut and split and stacked against the killing cold of winter. She had her husband's wood pile, and she had the timber down along the creek, and she meant to lay it up into walls. A surveyor passing through that June wrote it all down in his notebook, because he had never seen the like and did not expect to again. The logs were cut to a uniform length, 18 inches, no longer and no shorter, each end sawn flat and clean. They were not laid on their sides as a man lays up a log cabin. They were laid end out, the round-cut faces pointing at the weather, stacked like the wall of a woodpile that had somehow been told to stand up straight and hold a roof. Between them, filling every gap and binding the whole mass together, was lime mortar, mixed by hand in a trough and troweled thick. The walls, when they were done, would stand 2 feet through. In the entire house there was not to be a single stick of milled lumber in the walls. "What holds it up, then?" the surveyor asked her, tapping one of the flat log ends with his pencil. "The weight of it," she told him. "The whole wall is one piece, heavy as a hill. There is nothing on it for a wind to take hold of." He wrote that down too, and rode on, half convinced the woman was mad and half convinced she was not, and unable to decide which unsettled him more. To the valley, this was madness dressed up as thrift. Firewood was for burning. Every child on the plains knew it. You did not build your walls out of your own firewood, you did not wall yourself inside your own stove wood, and you certainly did not stake your daughter's life on a heap of log butts held together with mud. The men who rode past on the county road slowed their horses to look, and what they saw was a squat, ugly thing rising course by course out of the prairie, low to the ground, thick as a fort, with round wooden eyes staring out of it by the hundred. "She's walling herself in with next winter's fuel," a rancher named Amos Renner said at the store, and the men around the stove laughed, because it was a good line, and because it was true. Come January, that woman will be tearing her own house down a log at a time to keep from freezing. "A house wants lumber," the storekeeper agreed, leaning on his counter. "Straight sawn board, nailed square. Not a woodpile stood up on its end and told to behave." "Grief has turned her head," said another man by the stove. "Somebody ought to talk sense to the woman before that child of hers freezes in a heap of stove wood." But nobody went out to talk sense to her, because it was far easier to laugh, and because talking sense to Marta Hollis was a thing that had already been tried and given up. They took to calling it the Fool's Barn. Not the Hollis place, not the widow's house, the Fool's Barn. The name stuck as cruel names always stick, because it was easy to say and it cost nothing, and it let a man feel wiser than a woman doing something he did not understand. Marta heard the name. In a settlement that small, everyone hears everything. She did not argue, and she offered no explanation. When the storekeeper, meaning kindness, leaned over his counter and asked her plainly, "Marta, why won't you let me stand good for the lumber and put up a proper house before the winter comes?" She set down her flour and her thread and looked at him for a moment, and she gave him 4 words. "It will not blow." That was all. 4 words, and no more. He waited for something else, and there was nothing else. She gathered her goods and walked out to her wagon, and the men by the stove watched her go and shook their heads, and Amos Renner said that the poor thing had been touched by grief, and maybe she had. But here is what the men by the stove could not see, and what the surveyor with his notebook only half suspected. The thing Marta Hollis was building was not a woodpile. It was a single, enormous, unbroken mass of wood and stone, heavier than any framed house in the county, bonded into one body by the mortar until it was less a wall than a small cliff. It had almost no broad, flat face for a wind to shove against. It sat low and wide and rooted, its weight pressing straight down into the plains it stood on. Every tall, bright, proud frame house in the valley was built to catch the light and the eye. Hers was built to catch nothing at all. She was not walling herself in with next winter's fuel. She was building the one kind of roof that a wind could not take. And before that summer was over, on an afternoon the valley would talk about for the rest of their lives. The sky would come down the valley and settle the question for good, and every man who had laughed by that stove would learn which of them had truly been the fool. The work went on through June and into July, and the mockery went with it. A woman building alone is a slow spectacle, and the valley enjoyed it as a bored town enjoys anything. Boys rode out on Sundays to sit their ponies at the fence line and watch her carry logs. Some of the men made a wager of it, a real one, money laid down on the counter at the store. $1 says the first hard gale scatters it across the flat, Amos Renner announced, slapping the coin down on the wood. And another $1 says she's burning the walls for warmth by Christmas. Someone by the door laughed and told him he could not win both bets at once, and Renner said he did not much care which one he won. 2 others took the far side and bet only because Renner had gotten loud, and even they did not truly believe her house would stand. It was not a question of whether the fool's barn would come down. It was only a question of when. Marta let them talk and laid her logs. She had a rhythm to it by then, and Nell had a part in the rhythm, and even the dog had learned to stay clear of the mortar trough. Each morning the child sorted the cut lengths by size while her mother mixed the lime, And the two of them raised the walls a hand's width a day, no faster, because mortar that is hurried is mortar that fails. Once, sorting the logs, Nell asked why they pointed the wood the wrong way, round end out into the weather, and her mother did not slow her trowel. Because the round side turns a wind, and a flat wall only catches it, she said. Your father worked that out before you were born. Flat things blow. Round and heavy and low things stay. The child nodded as though that settled the matter, and for her it did. What none of the watchers understood was that everything they were laughing at was the reason the house would live. A frame house on the plains was a marvel of thin, light, clever carpentry. Stud walls no thicker than a man's hand, sheathed in board and clad in siding, nailed and braced and stood up tall and hollow, with a high steep roof to shed the snow. It was a proud thing to look at and a cheap thing to raise, and it was, though no one in that valley wished to hear it, a sail. A tall, light, hollow box full of air, presenting a broad flat side to whatever came across the open country. There was nothing between the plains of Kansas and the mountains to slow a wind down, and when a true wind came, a frame house did not so much fall as fly. Marta's house could not fly, because there was nothing of it that a wind could lift. Consider only the weight. Before she was finished, she would lay up something near 3,000 cut logs, each one bedded in mortar, and the mortar alone came to load after load of sand and lime, hauled by the barrelful from the creek and the kiln. The whole standing mass would weigh many times what the heaviest barn in the county weighed. A wind does its damage by finding a flat face to push and a light body to throw, and her house offered it neither. The round ends of the logs turned the weather aside as a cobbled street turns a boot heel. There was no broad wall to lean on, no tall gable to grip, no hollow room of trapped air waiting to burst. 2 feet of solid wood and stone stood between the inside of that house and the sky, low to the earth, wide to the earth, rooted to the earth by its own dead weight. There was more, though the valley would only learn the rest of it come winter. Wood is a poor road for heat to travel, and lime mortar is not much better, and 2 feet of the two of them together made a wall that held the warmth of a small fire long into the coldest night, and held out the summer sun long into the hottest day. The house that looked like a wood pile would, in the years to come, prove the warmest dwelling for 40 miles, warmer than any drafty frame parlor the valley was so proud of. But that was a gift for later. The gift that mattered first, the gift Marta had staked everything on, was that her roof could not be taken. And when the storekeeper's boy rode out one evening and asked her, honestly, as only a child will ask a thing, "Aren't you scared a big wind is just going to knock it flat, Mrs. Hollis?" She wiped the lime from her hands and gave him the only answer she ever gave anyone. "It will not blow." She did not say it like a boast. She said it plainly, as a fact read off a page, finished and closed. And something in how she said it made the boy stop laughing, though he could not have told you why. By the middle of July the walls were up and the roof was on, and the valley turned its attention back to the thing the valley was truly proud of. That summer the settlement was growing, and growing meant tall houses. 2 proud 2-story frame homes had gone up along the main road that spring, one for the storekeeper and one for a cattleman named Cordwood who had done well, and a third was framed and half-sided at the far end of town. They had gabled roofs and glass windows shipped in crates and painted porches, and they stood up bright and white above the sod houses and dugouts like a promise of what the whole valley would someday be. A man measured his standing by his house, and the tallest houses belonged to the men who laughed loudest at the fool's barn. Marta's house, finished, did not look like a promise of anything. It sat low on its rise, a long honey-colored mass of log ends gone golden in the sun, its mortar lines pale and clean, two small, deep-set windows glowing amber at night when the lamp was lit inside. It looked, the valley agreed, like a thing an animal might live in. Corwin, riding past, said it looked like a beaver had gotten ambitious. It became a joke a man could always reach for when the talk ran dry. Have you seen the fool's barn lately? Reckon it will make it to winter. And underneath the joke, unspoken, ran the wager still resting on the store counter, waiting on the first real wind. Through those weeks, the mockery hardened into a kind of local sport. A pair of boys, bolder than the rest, rode up one dusk and pried a single log loose from an unmortared course she had not yet finished, and made off with it whooping, and Marta simply cut another and set it back the next morning, and said nothing to anyone about it. Grown men predicted the collapse with the confidence of prophets. It would go in the first hard blow, they said. It would go under the dead weight of its own roof. It would rot from the mortar, holding damp against the wood. Each of them had a reason, and each reason was pronounced as settled fact. And not one of the men offering it had ever in his life laid up such a wall or read a single page about one. They knew only that the thing was strange, and strangeness, out on the plains, sat very close to sin. What none of them let themselves wonder, even once, was the plainest question of all, the one the whole summer was quietly bending toward. They never asked what it would mean if the widow turned out to be right. They did not have to wait long, and the wind that came was not the wind anyone had bet on. The last days of July on the Kansas plains that year were the kind that pressed down on a person. The air went thick and still and yellow. The cattle grew restless and would not settle. Old settlers, the ones who had come out in the first years and learned the sky, watched the west and said little. Heat like that, standing heat, was the heat that built a storm. And a storm built on the open plains in high summer was not the gentle gray rain of the east. It was a thing with a center to it, a thing that could reach down. On the last afternoon of the month, the sky in the west went the color of a bad bruise, green and black, and shot through with a strange brass light, and it came on faster than a rider could carry the warning. Men who had crossed an ocean and buried children and broken 100 miles of sod, hard men who feared very little, looked at that sky and felt the old animal fear crawl up the back of the neck. There was a wall of cloud coming down the Solomon, and beneath it dropping and lifting and dropping again, a slender turning rope of darkness that touched the earth and tore a line across it. A tornado, in a country with no cellars deep enough and no shelter tall enough, is not weather. It is a verdict. It does not argue, and it cannot be reasoned with, and it takes no account of a man's standing, or the height of his house, or the size of the wager on the store counter. It comes down the valley it chooses, and it passes its judgment on whatever it finds there, and there is no appeal. It was coming, that afternoon, straight down the Solomon toward the settlement, toward the two proud houses on the main road and the half-sided third, toward the sod dugouts and the barns and the church with its new steeple. And it was coming toward a low honey-colored house on a rise above the creek, where a young widow had just heard her daughter come running in from the yard. Nell came through the door white-faced, the dog Boone at her heels with his hackles up and a low sound in his chest. "Mama," the girl said, "the sky is wrong." Marta had already seen it through the small, deep window. She did not shout, and she did not run. She had been a plainswoman long enough to know that panic wastes the seconds a person cannot spare. "Is it going to fall on us, Mama?" Nell whispered, and Marta took the child by the shoulders once, firmly, and looked straight into her frightened face. "No, not this house. Get under the heavy table against the inside wall, hold on to Boone, and do not come out until I come for you." The child went, and the dog went with her. Then Marta went to the one thing that was not yet finished. She had built the walls that no wind could take, but the openings were still weak, the two small windows and the low door, and she knew it. She had cut a set of heavy plank shutters for exactly this. Thick oak slabs barred from within, and one of them had come loose from its pin that morning and hung open on the weather side. Outside, the light had gone to a sick brown dusk, though it was afternoon, and the air had begun to move. First a hot breath, and then a hard, steady shove, and the noise was coming, the sound old settlers described ever after as a freight train that had no track and no end. She braced her shoulder against the loose shutter and pushed it closed against the rising wind. It fought her. The wind had gotten under the edge of it and wanted it, and for a long moment the widow stood pinned in the doorway of the house the whole valley laughed at, one hand flat against the heavy plank, her feet set, her daughter and her dog behind her in the amber lamplight, and the black rope of the storm bearing down across the flat toward the rise. She got the bar down. She dropped it into its iron seat and threw her weight against it, and it held. And she turned and crossed the room and got down under the table with Nell and Boone and put her arms over all three of them. And she waited. What came over the settlement in the next 4 minutes was the thing the plains keep in reserve for the days they mean to be remembered. It came down the main road first. The half-sided third house, the new one, simply was not there anymore between one breath and the next, lifted whole and burst apart in the air into a snow of white boards. Corwin's proud 2-story home, the finest in the county, the one with the shipped glass and the painted porch, stood for a heartbeat with the wind inside it, and then buckled like a thing made of playing cards. The roof torn off and thrown a 1/4 mile, the tall stud walls folding and flying, the whole bright marvel reduced in seconds to a low pile of splintered lumber no different from any wood pile on the plains. The storekeeper's house followed it. The church steeple the valley had been so proud of snapped at its base and was gone. Barns opened like paper. The frame houses, every proud one of them, the tall, light, clever hollow boxes full of trapped air, did exactly what such a box does when the plains decide to lift it. They flew, and they came apart, and they fell as kindling. Up on the rise, the low honey-colored house shed the storm. There is no other word for what it did. The wind that unmade the settlement found nothing on that squat mass of log ends to grip and nothing light enough to throw. It shoved against 2 feet of mortared wood and stone rooted to the ground by its own dead weight. And the house did not lift because there was no flat sail to lift, and it did not fold because there was no hollow frame to fold, and it did not fly because a small cliff does not fly. The round faces of 3,000 logs turned the wind and let it pass. The heavy shutters held. Inside, in the dark under the table, Marta felt the whole world roar and the pressure change and pull at her ears, and she felt the house take the blow and stand, felt it stand as bedrock stands, and she held her daughter and the trembling dog, and she did not move, and the lamp, tucked low and sheltered in its deep window, never even went out. Then the roar moved off down the valley and thinned and was gone, and there was a silence such as the plains almost never give. And into that silence, small and steady and impossible, came the light of a single lamp still burning in a deep-set amber window on the rise, the only whole roof, as it would turn out, for miles in any direction. The people of the Solomon Valley came up out of the ground into a world that had been erased. Those who lived had lived because they had gone down, into root cellars and storm holes and the low dugouts the frame house men had privately pitied. They climbed out into the strange yellow calm after, and could not at first make sense of what their eyes were telling them. The main road was gone, not damaged. Gone. Where the tall, proud houses had stood there were only stone foundations and scattered fields of pale broken board, mile on mile of splintered lumber, as though the whole settlement had been a model built of matchsticks and swept off a table by a child's arm. Men stood in the ruins of everything they had measured their lives by and turned in slow circles and said nothing, because there was nothing that would come. And then, one by one, they looked up at the rise above the creek, and there it stood. Whole, untouched, the squat, ugly, honey-colored house they had bet $1 the first gale would scatter. The fool's barn sat exactly where it had sat that morning, its roof on, its walls sound, its 2 deep windows glowing amber against the failing light, and a thread of smoke rising straight and calm from its chimney into the cleared and quiet sky. It was the only thing standing between the creek and the far ridge. It was the only lit window in a dark and flattened land. They came to her, of course. There was nowhere else to go. As the dark came down that night, cold now with the rain that follows such storms, they came up the rise in ones and twos and families. The men who had laughed at the store and the boys who had ridden out on Sundays to watch her carry logs, and the cattleman Cordwood with his wife and children and nothing else in the world, and Amos Renner, who had bet $1 against her roof, carrying a hurt child wrapped in a horse blanket. They came to the low door of the fool's barn, wet and shocked and homeless, and they stood there, and not one of them could find a word to say to the woman they had mocked all summer. Marta Hollis opened her door. She looked out at the ruined people of the valley crowded on her step in the rain, and whatever she might have said, whatever a smaller soul would have said and been within its rights to say, she did not say it. She stood aside from her own doorway. "Come in out of it," she told them. "There's warmth." And they came in. That 2-foot mass of wood and stone that held the heat of a small fire held it now for 30 and then 40 souls. The warm interior the valley had laughed at as a beaver's den took in the whole homeless remnant of the settlement and did not grow cold. Nell carried water. Boone lay by the door and let the frightened children put their hands in his fur. Marta set her lamp in the deep window where it could be seen from below, and she boiled what she had and shared it out, and she made pallets on her swept clay floor for the very people who had named her house a fool's barn, and she asked none of them for an apology, and none of them offered one, because an apology would have been too small a thing for what the day had shown them, and they all knew it. "We had nowhere else in the world to go," Corwin said from the floor, not quite able to meet her eyes, "after the things I said about this house. A beaver's den, I called it, to anyone who would listen." "I know what you called it," Marta answered, "and there was no cruelty in it. Rest now. The children need the quiet more than I need an apology." "My house is gone," another man said, dazed into the warm dark. "Everything I built, all of it, just gone. You are alive, and your children are alive," she told him. "A house can be raised again. Warm yourself and be still." Amos Renner sat against the honey-colored logs with his hurt child asleep at last in his arms, and he looked around the low, warm room at the roof that had not blown, and after a long while he said the only thing that could be said. "How did you know?" he asked her, quietly, so as not to wake the boy. "How could you be so sure it would stand?" And Marta, wiping her hands, ready to answer as she always answered, found that on this night she did not want to give the 4 short words she had given all summer. Because the truth behind those 4 words was not hers. The truth belonged to a man in the churchyard, and it was time, she decided, that somebody in the Solomon Valley finally heard it. The house had not been her idea. It had been Elias's. Years before, back in the county they came from, her husband had watched a summer storm reach down and take a neighbor's fine tall frame house with the family still inside it, and he had helped dig afterward, and he had never spoken of what they found. He carried it quietly, the memory of a proud house that flew, and when he brought his own young family out to the open Solomon country where there was nothing at all to slow a wind, the memory came with him. He had read, somewhere in his few books, of the old Cordwood walls that thrifty settlers raised in timber-poor country, low and heavy and bonded into one mass, and something in the plain sense of it had answered the fear he carried. He had started the walls himself, that first spring, hauling and cutting the 18-inch lengths, mixing the lime, laying the lowest courses broad and deep. He told the men who asked that he was only saving the cost of lumber, because a man does not easily say the true thing out loud. But he had told Marta the true thing. Once, on an evening when Nell was small and asleep between them, and a hard wind was worrying at the canvas of the sod house they lived in while he built. "The whole county thinks you have lost your senses," she had teased him once, and he had only smiled and gone on laying his logs. Then, another night, he had put his hand flat on the growing log wall and told her the truth of it. "Let them laugh, Marta. I do not care what they call it. I am raising the one roof the sky can never take back so that no wind will ever come in the night and lift it off our girl." That was the promise the walls were made of. He had died with them half finished, and Marta had understood, standing at his grave, that she was not being asked to sell a claim and go home. She was being asked to finish a roof over their child. So she had. And every time a valley full of clever men had asked her why, and she had given them 4 flat words and nothing more, the 4 words had only ever been the short and speakable end of her husband's long and unspeakable love. He built it, she told them, there in the low warm room, on the night the storm took everything in the valley but the fool's barn. Elias built it so that no gale could ever tear the roof from over his girl. I only finished what he had already started. She did not tell it to shame them. She told it because a good man had been right, and had been laughed at for it, and had not lived to be proven right, and someone owed it to him to say his name over the roof that had just saved the people who laughed. When she finished, the room was quiet, and Amos Renner looked down at his sleeping child under that impossible roof, and he did not say he was sorry, because he understood at last that sorry was not the size of it. He only nodded. Once, the nod of a man setting something down that he would carry differently from then on. By the following spring, the Solomon Valley had changed its mind about a great many things. When the settlement rebuilt, it did not rebuild the same. 3 more low honey-colored houses of stacked log ends and lime mortar rose along the creek that year, and men who had wagered against such a wall now measured their logs to a careful 18 inches and asked the Hollis widow humbly to come and look at their mortar before it set. Corwin built one. Amos Renner built one. And he built it broad and low and rooted, and he never once called it a fool's barn, and neither did anyone else, because the name had lost the only thing that had ever given it power, which was the certainty that the woman was a fool. The joke had gone out of it entirely. What was left was a plain fact standing on a rise, warm in winter and cool in summer, with its lamp lit in a deep window, the safest roof in the county. The first winter proved the rest of it. When the blizzards came down out of the north and the rebuilt frame houses burned through their firewood by the cord just to stay livable, the honey-colored house on the rise held a single small fire's warmth from dusk clear through to morning, its thick walls giving the heat back slowly all night long like a stone left warming at the edge of a hearth. Word of that traveled further than the story of the tornado ever did. Because a plains winter is a longer enemy than any single afternoon, and a home a poor family could keep warm on almost nothing was worth more to a struggling settler than any painted porch in the county. Men who had once come out of a Sunday to laugh now rode up to measure and to ask. Marta showed them freely how to cut the lengths true, how to slake and mix the lime, how to bed the flat ends deep, how to keep a wall low and broad and let its own great weight do the work no nail could ever do. She kept none of it back. A method that could save a child from the cold and the wind together, she said, was not a thing that any decent person had the right to hoard. Marta Hollis lived out her life in that house, and Nell grew up under the roof her father had promised her and never got to finish, and the dog Boone slept by the low door until he was old. And in the valley, in the years after, when the young ones asked about the strange thick house on the rise and why it was built of firewood, the old ones would tell them the whole of it, the mockery and the wager, and the day the sky came down the Solomon, leveling every proud house but that one. If it was so foolish, a child asked once, why was it the only house left standing? And the old man who was asked only shook his head and smiled. Because we were the fool's son, he said. Never her. We just had the good luck to find it out before it killed us. But they mostly left out the laughing. It shamed them a little, still, and besides, it had stopped mattering long ago. People forgot the laughing. What they remembered was whose roof was still there.